Hello and welcome to the Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast, where we listen to people's fairy encounters. But take heed, we're not talking about winged Tinkerbells here. These are real fairies, real encounters that took people like you and I by surprise. Stay a while and hear their stories. My name is Jo Hickey Hall, and I'm a folklore researcher. This podcast is of course free, but to ensure it continues, it does require your support. If you can support the show and its continued research, there are a number of tiers to choose from at patreon.com/the Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast. We have a Discord private discussion group and a monthly live chat, plus regular personal updates behind the scenes. With your support, I hope to dedicate more time to this research and producing fortnightly episodes. Alternatively, you can really help support by subscribing, rating and sharing your favourite episodes with your friends. Thanks. Hello dear listener, I hope you're well and hopefully getting a chance to catch up with loved ones. It's so important to feel connected, particularly in these times. Thank you for your emails and messages, which I love receiving. Please keep them coming via scarletofthefae.com and tweet me at _remain_curious. A huge thank you to my amazing Curious crew on Patreon for all their generous and loving support, and a special shout out to Jo, who's recently joined as part of the Weird Folk. We held our monthly Discord chat this week, and it felt great to be able to discuss deep experiences with each other and exchange ideas. I found it really enlightening. And that's what this project is all about, sharing encounters and perspectives and, in doing so, acknowledging that there is much more to this world than we generally learn about. In my view, opening to new ideas is what drives humanity forwards, so I say yes to more of this sort of thing. If you'd like to join us and support this project ever onwards, please head to patreon.com/the Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast. This will help provide me with set research time and the space to write a book about all these and many more extraordinary encounters. In this episode, I speak to a fellow researcher of the strange, Thomas Freese. Thomas is an author, a storyteller and an artist. To date, he's written 11 books and 200 articles, and much of his research is focused on collecting people's extraordinary experiences, including ghost stories and encounters with nature spirits, angels, fairies, and multidimensional beings. In his storytelling role, Thomas visits schools and finds that many children want to tell him about their own strange experiences. We talk about this, and he shares some of the many otherworldly encounters that he's collected over the years. You'll find links to Thomas's work on scarletofthefae.com. I hope you enjoy our chat, and there's a bonus episode for the Curious crew on Patreon, in which we discuss Thomas's own fairy experiences, and he also shares some very unnerving encounters with paranormal creatures known as black-eyed children. These beings are known for appearing at people's homes and vehicles and asking to be let inside. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and I'll be back at the end for a quick chat. Time to
So I've always been interested for a really long time, since I was a child, in kind of the hidden world. And I remember we have something here called scholastic books for children in school.
Oh, yeah.
And stuff. And if you're a reader, and I was a really big reader, I was years ahead in reading, even in grade school. You know, I'd do the flashlight, under the covers when I was supposed to be sleeping. But one book I got a hold of in Scholastic, which actually, believe it or not, so I'm talking about the 1960s, is still in print, and it's still in Scholastic, and it's called Strangely Enough. And
Wow.
it has stories of the Bermuda Triangle and ghosts and the devil's footprints, burned into the snowy landscape going across in a straight line in New England, and raining frogs and just anything weird and wonderful. So I just, gobbled that up. And around the same time, I've kind of noticed that around age 12 or 13, a lot of children, kind of have this bump up in psychic awareness.
Mm.
Um, and so I was about that same time that I was awakened in the middle of the night by a really loud, bump. But it was like someone took their fist and slammed it against the wall. And I grew up in a small Catholic family of 8. And so, it could have been anyone, but, it was middle of the night. And I didn't hear my dad like stumbling down the hallway, like he had bumped into something and cussing or something. So I really was perplexed there, just was wide awake. Like, what was that? And my brother Mike, he was a year older, so he got the top bunk. So, and then
Mhm.
sometimes we're falling asleep, we would talk. And if he said something I didn't like, if he was teasing me, I'd just kick up. Obviously I had that ability to kind of bump him a little bit myself. So I asked him, I couldn't see him. And I said, in the dark, I said, Mike, did you hear that? And he said, yes. So I said, okay.
Mm.
When you get to that age, middle school, and you start questioning things and wondering about things. So I thought, tomorrow I'm going to ask my mom about this. So I prepared a question. And the question for my mom I was going to ask is, have you ever seen and heard anything you can't explain? And when I tell ghost stories, as a storyteller, to kids, we talk about this.
Yeah.
In whatever way that works for the setting, we talk about it, and I put these stories out there, and the kids looking in my eyes like, yeah, he knows, like, because they're just
Mm.
desperate to talk about, things of experience. And of course, they experience psychic reality, whatever you call it, metaphysical reality, as much as adults, if not more.
Yeah.
So anyway, but my mom is like Spock. She's very logical. She was a chemistry major in the 1940s. When she graduated, she worked for the defense industry analyzing. They took pretty pictures of the Soviet Union, and she analyzed those. So she reads like mathematical string theory just for kicks. You know, she's a Virgo. Virgo, very.
Okay, I get you. We have a Virgo in the family.
Okay, alrighty. So, and her maiden name is Dettenwanger. So she raised us 6 kids with German precision. So I knew she'd say no, and I did. I went in the morning. I said, "Mom, have you ever seen or heard anything you can't explain?" And she said no. And then I counted 1, 2, 3 beats, and she said, "Well, there was a time."
Mm.
And she told me the first ghost story I ever heard from someone. So not, like Disney or, books or movies, but, someone that you knew and trusted. And particularly coming from my mom, who's so logical and, really got a really strong left brain.
Mm.
Um, she was riding a horse up at the old Pioneer Cemetery on our land, my great aunt's land, and they were grandchildren of Irish immigrants. And there were like 5 sisters, I believe, 5 or 6 sisters, and one of them was my maternal grandmother, and that's a whole other story, Burns Mill. But so she saw a guy. She came up on the horse, right, and saw a guy sitting on a tombstone. It wasn't our cemetery. It was a guy from England. He was a Dr. Smith, and he passed away, and his widow set up this, cute little, wrought iron fence and the plot there, and
Mm.
she returned to England. So she probably saw Dr. Smith. She said she saw a guy sitting there in a long gray beard, wearing old time clothes, and she just happened to be riding a horse that is kind of a special needs horse, and that's another story. But the horse stumbled. She looked down for a moment to attend to the horse. When she looked up again, he had vanished. So there I was, 12 years old, getting the straight, deal from my mom, thinking, okay, there's something there. There really is. And over the years, getting to know the kindred spirits and then collecting ghost stories, always been fascinated. And then writing books of true ghost story encounters, and then not just ghosts, but encounters with spirits and angels, and then broadening out to, the fairy folk and
Mm.
witches and Sasquatch and multidimensional entities, and just scoop up whatever I could.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
So, but, and, just getting to know those people and looking in their eyes and just seeing them being very honest, like,
Mm.
this is just a weird thing that happened. They weren't, like trying to construct some kind of fake narrative.
Yeah.
Um, So multiply that times, I don't know, between 600 and 1,000 stories I've collected. And
Wow.
so, the anecdotal evidence is just so overwhelming. But I do sometimes, getting back to the fairy folk, I do, see with that third eye, the fairy folk around them
Mhm.
or in their home, or we'll talk about, hey, if you get out in nature more, or what particular environment is good for them. Is it water? Is it woods? And, how the fairy folk are wanting to communicate with them or work with them. So that comes up in readings. Plus, I do have a few just kind of gentle little experiences more directly of my own. The most recent was called Tree Spirits and Wood Wisdom. And so that does include some of the fairy encounters, stories that people have shared with me. And I just feel so honored. And then I turn around and I tell them live, either in talks at metaphysical events or hired as a storyteller in schools or libraries. People are just so relieved when they see me talking about these things, because they're just, oh my gosh, I want to talk about what happened to me. Or I was telling animal ghost stories in this kind of Appalachian part of Kentucky. And this boy come up afterwards and said, "Mr. Freese, I sure like your ghost stories." He said, "I had a hamster and it died, but it not, that wheel." So, kids say the darndest things.
Yeah, they do. It's great that you're going into schools and telling these stories as well. I'm really encouraged to hear that schools are so open about explorations into these sorts of subjects.
So I started becoming a self-discovered artist in the 80s, doing the wood crafts. And then when I moved from Santa Fe, New Mexico to Lexington, Kentucky, I felt a shift that I wanted to teach art too. And so I became a teaching artist. What I would do is I had visual arts residencies, and I would have each kid class for an hour. And then I would say, I wanted to practice storytelling. So I had 10 minutes left in the hour. And I say, "Hey kids, if you get everything cleaned up in 5 minutes, in the last 5 minutes, I'll tell you a story." So I started practicing, and picking stories that I liked and telling them. And I just really loved the immediacy and just how you can reach children just in such an incredible direct way. And I play guitar and harmonica and other instruments. So,
Beautiful.
I mean, it's just, you can skip past all kinds of blah, blah talking and just go straight to speak to their right brain, by throwing out a folk tale. And I created more programs, including fairy tales, and I had ghost stories. And I got to be known just locally, as a storyteller. And so a school would find out about me or say, "Oh, we got this author, this Kentucky author, you can come in and tell ghost stories." And of course, October was a big time. So as I would come in, and I would never identify myself as a psychic, I would just, be the storyteller author, and be very respectful, obviously, of other people's differences. And some schools were very conservative locations. So, but people respond as they do on different levels. So one teacher or one librarian might be, "Well, those are just cute folk tales." Even if I presented them and said, "These are true stories that people shared with me," they would just interpret that in their brain as like, "Oh, that's cute, Mr. Freese," because none of those are real. And I would just kind of be standing in front of them like, "Oh, okay." So people would take it wherever they were at, and they would just interpret that in their mind if they were grown-ups and didn't want to believe in that. So yeah, I would go in as a storyteller and as an author and as an artist, and then the serendipities would just happen where some children would just they couldn't help. They had something to share. I was telling a different animal ghost story audience in middle school. This 7th grade girl came up afterward and says, "Mr. Freese, I keep horses. One of them died and I still see it." I'm not surprised by anything these days. And I was, agreeing with her. And she said, "No, you don't understand. I still have to give it feed and water, and I can watch the feed and water go down."
Gosh, yeah. Wow.
So these kids are just really just dying to talk about their experiences, because no one wants to hear. Like the parents will say, "We're going to sell our house someday, so you're not going to tell anyone in school that our house is haunted."
Yeah, there's that
Or
aspect.
so there's that incredible social pressure, the editing, this, and I've had it happen to me too. I saw a thought form one time, and it zoomed across from my solar plexus to this nice lady I was hanging out with. And my immediate conscious thought was, I didn't see that. So, it's so quick how we self-edit, because of that's kind of filtered down from society. So yes, I go into schools and libraries, and people that want to, like grown-ups, they'll come up afterwards with stories to share. The fairy stories are, a smaller quantity. They're almost like what ghost stories were 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah, this is my feeling too. Yeah, I feel like it's kind of building up, but it's still very much sort of on the sidelines, isn't it?
There's just so many different creatures out there, other
Mm.
beings. And you can, like a pachinko game, the metal balls come down, they hit the different nails and fall in different categories. And
Yeah.
so that's why some of my books are not just ghost stories, they're called ghost spirits and angels, because we try to exercise that discernment. I was touching the shoulder just then. Was it a ghost? Was it a spirit? Was it an angel?
Mm.
So even with the nature spirit category, you get into these, are you splitting hairs? Like what, like Spring-Heeled
Yeah.
Jack and the Mothman, like, is that a nature spirit, or is it a multidimensional entity, or is it a cryptid, and the children are really fascinated by that. They just, they've watched the ghost hunter shows. They know about EMF meters and thermal scanners, and, they know about all that. They're consuming, whether it's, you know, um, fantasy movies, or reading the books, or Harry Potter or whatever.
Mm.
So
It's a good
but
point. Yeah.
yeah, so I have always been fascinated with nature spirits from reading Finhorn, Dorothy McLean,
Hmm.
talking to the nature spirits, and Peter and Eileen Caddy, and the Finhorn story, and then reading the Edgar Casey material. And he had some, invisible friends or whatever. He had some nature spirit friends. And so as I read metaphysical literature in the 1970s, I got really familiar with that. And I thought, I'd like to, I'd like to see these guys.
Mm.
Um, but, sometimes it takes a long trajectory for grown-ups. Kids might be more immediate, but grown-ups, I don't know. We have to work. We have to do all kinds of responsibilities and family things. And but over the decades, it got to a point in the early 2000s for me that I just started reading about Man of the Woods and Bigfoot and things. And I thought, I want to make contact. I've already had this journey as a psychic reader. I've seen, read about auras, and then I started seeing auras. And I read about thought forms, then I saw a thought form, and I read about, all these things in turn, and they all were, as I earnestly and respectfully sought,
Yeah.
they were, gifted to me, or at the very least, I would get like these, something from the other side, like, we're acknowledging you, like, here's a little gift, like, here's a synchronicity, here's an angel to help
Yeah.
you out. Yeah.
And you're following the path. And the thing is with those types of experiences as well, is that I think people don't realize how simple it is to be able to see an aura. It's a very straightforward, you can teach yourself to see auras. I've been in different workshops where people have played that out as an exercise, and it is just a very straightforward thing to do. But for many people, the idea of seeing an aura is really kind of out there, and either impossible or something that they would need a special gift to be able to do. But you don't. You just relaxing your eyes. Obviously, it helps if the person that you're looking at is against a white wall, so that you can see the colours and the thought forms coming off of them. And there are different exercises where you can ask that person to think about somebody close to their heart and see how the colours change around in their aura. This is possible to just to make that so much more available to people.
Yeah, I agree, you're so right. And the ironic thing is, we don't necessarily have a discussion about seeing versus perception. And I think we
Mm.
think perception is receptive, when a lot of times it's more projective. And so, with auras, it was actually in church. And I was in my later 30s, and I was going to Episcopal church, and I was in the choir. And then, so just in that really meditative time, and watching the priest come up and at the pulpit, and I was like, what? Did I just look at a light? There's this neon blue around his head. And then as he moved around, it moved around with him. And then I was like, oh, that's what it is. So I started noticing the auras. And then I realized just what you're saying, that it's actually always there. It's we see the auras, but we don't perceive them, or whichever way you want to, phrase that. So I think we all physically see auras. That information energetically is coming to all of us, but we don't perceive them, and that gets back to the socialization again, and how we. I mean, something could be right in front of us, and literally, if we don't believe in it, so it gets down to that quote. You switch it around. Some things have to be believed to be seen.
Yeah.
So I've written 11 books. The nature spirits appear in definitely in 2 of my books.
Yeah.
And the older one is called More True Tales of Ghost Spirits and Angels. And that has a section of friends and family, their encounters with the fairy folk. And then the recent one is Tree Spirits and Wood Wisdom. So that's focused
Lovely.
on tree spirits. And so there's some stories in there.
And I'll put those links as well in my show notes for people so that they can go and get those. Healing has helped me many times in my life when I'd reached a point where something needed to change. In 2005, I trained with Martin Brofman to learn the body mirror system of healing, which was life-changing for me. It's based on the idea that the parts of your body that don't work well reflect the parts of your life that don't work well, and about which you have tension in your consciousness. The understanding is that tension is stress, and stress causes symptoms. In a distance healing or in-person session, I move up the chakras, returning each one to wholeness using a colour map. During the process, I see images and situations, I hear words or receive impressions that tell me something about what caused the tension in that person's life. The feedback at the end of the session is a really big part of the healing. If you're interested in a chakra healing session, you can contact me at scarletofthefae@gmail.com.
My friend Teresa, she's passed away, but we lived together, and she told me about her mom worked at the university, and in the 70s there was a lot of things happening and changing, and people were experimenting with marijuana and all kinds of fun stuff. So someone evidently slipped some LSD in her coffee.
Oh my God,
And
that's a nightmare. That's
well,
such a bad thing to do to anyone. But I guess back then maybe it was just like part and parcel, but
right, like here's some brownies, right? So I'm just totally not into drugs at all myself. I have to be convinced like once every 5 years just to even take some aspirin.
I mean, I should say it's not that that she took it. It's more that it wasn't her choice to take it. I mean, it's any
Right.
kind of trip, it's like,
Right.
surely it has to be your choice to decide to go on a trip or not, because sometimes it's just really not a good idea to be
Yeah.
tripping if you're in some kind of
Yeah.
emotional state or whatever. So but yeah, I
Right.
accept, like in the 60s and 70s the drugs were free flowing, and maybe this is
Right.
just something that happened.
Yeah. It's not like she was on an ayahuasca retreat, and
Yeah.
there was the protective space and the preparation and everything. But it is interesting. I just want to mention what Teresa said that she saw, and the fun, because they're very, very Irish, Teresa's family, and traced back to literally like her ancestor, did surveying work with George Washington and served in the Revolutionary War and all this. But the Clarkson is the last name, and they came from Ireland, and actually have a banshee story from that family that occurred in Oklahoma City, because it's a family ghost, came over from Ireland. But Teresa said that her mom said, she drank the funny coffee. And she said, when I saw the little green men dancing, I knew it was time to go home.
Yeah.
So there's that chemical that, opened up, obviously unprepared, but what she saw was the little, fairy guys. And I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting.
My sister Jane lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and this story is in my book, Tree Spirits and Wood Wisdom. And she tells about a certain area outside Santa Fe where she loves to go take walks in nature. And there's some homes out in the area, but there's also some open space. and it's that typical New Mexico kind of you know uh, environment, with the
Mm.
the cactus, and actually Santa Fe is 2,000 feet higher than Denver, so it's different than like a
Wow.
Tucson kind of desert. Yeah, it's called high desert, and there's pinon, which is the native pine, and juniper, and it's kind of rocky and sandy a bit, but it is high desert. Well, you go down in these little drainage places that are often like dry riverbeds, and in Spanish they're called arroyos. And she was winding, following the gravel road, just kind of coming around a juniper or pinon or whatever, and she literally had to hit the brakes in this arroyo. And that's one place that people can trek easily across the land, is in the arroyo, because it's usually flatter and just kind of sandy soil, and as long as there's hopefully not some wall of water coming down from the rain in the mountains, it's a safe place to go across the land easily. And anyway, this figure just ran across the arroyo. She had to slam on the brakes, and she said he just like had these clothes were like, they were like sticks, all these sticks draped on his outfit. And just as soon as she saw him run across the road, he just disappeared.
Mm. So interesting. I've actually seen one of these myself. And the one that we saw was running as well. It was running really fast, and it disappeared. But I was with two other people at the time. And I do find those fascinating. And obviously to hear from our guest that we had on that particular episode, I was so amazed to hear his story, because I'd never spoken. Well, I've spoken to one other guy that has seen something that he described as a tree man. It sounded slightly different to what I saw. What I saw was definitely like a stick man. But it was so great to speak to him, and I didn't know that he was going to talk about that. He just began telling me about this experience. I didn't know what it was, and then he talked about that, and it was just it really does help, that validation when you've seen something. I mean, obviously for me, I had two other people with me at the time, and it was bizarre. We turned to each other and we were laughing. We said, "Did you see that?" All three of us saw it. But to I tried to research more about these types of beings, and I've never really been able to find very much, hardly anything at all, actually, of encounters, more kind of folklore, I suppose, and then popping up in fantasy and literature. So to hear someone else talk about their experience, so this is really great to hear, actually, that your sister also saw one of these. The other guy that I spoke to was I think he was in Brazil. So they definitely seem to be around on that continent, and they're certainly in and around Britain, because I've seen one, and so has the other guy that I spoke to. He was based in Britain as well. So that is interesting, isn't it?
Right. And as I've listened to your amazing podcast, I heard a little bit of the thoughts or discussion about do we have all of these kinds of creatures in all lands, more or less.
Mm.
And I really believe that they are just all over, and so it's not just limited. Even like if you read or get into the Bigfoot, Sasquatch information, it just seems
Mm.
like they really are just about everywhere. And I did do some travels in Alaska, and I met some folks that um, had one lady that had some nature spirits encounters, and also, well, I just love it all. It's, Bigfoot's, UFO, whatever. It's all great.
Me too.
Um, but my friend that I met in Alaska, and this is hopefully going to be in one of my future books that focus on nature spirits. But she actually, as a child, she grew up near Fairbanks, and she encountered just like some gnome guys that just were really fascinated with her. She, I guess, had like long, pretty blonde hair, and they were just, thought she was just the cat's meow, and they invited her down into their little, there was like a wooden, level with the ground door that she had never noticed because she grew up, with other siblings, and they would play in this one area outside their home, and it was, kind of had some rural aspect. But anyway, they just invited her to have some tea,
Mm.
and she was just a child, and so she went down, and there were wooden steps, and the one guy, so it's like a rudimentary kind of kitchen, and a table and chairs to sit on, and they were excited to have her visit, and one of them put on some water for tea, um, and they were just fascinated with her, and I think she was pretty intrigued with them, and so they said, well, you've got to stay for lunch. And so they started discussing, like, what they were going to go get, I guess, for greens or whatever to forage for something to eat. And then she said they got into a spirited discussion. They both went up the stairs to go outside to, like they couldn't decide who was going to get to stay with her and who was going to go,
Okay.
to forage, and but they were stuck in that debate, and they just went up and were still talking about it. And then after a while, sitting down there by herself, she thought, well, I probably ought to go home now. And she didn't feel like socially, you know, um, kind of forced to, like stay there and be social with them. And, and really it was probably a good thing that she went on up the stairs, and she went back home, and she told her mom. She says her mom just, totally didn't believe anything she presented, and she said she never ever saw that wooden door, that was level with the ground. She never saw that again.
Wowzers. How old was she? Do you know?
I think she was fairly young. I'm gonna guess like maybe about 5 years old.
Yeah, that's kind of what I imagined as well. And I mean, but I'd love to know whether, what was happening in her life at the time as well, and whether that kind of marked anything, whether it was her relationship with nature or anything else. But that's a really powerful experience, isn't it? And it'd be great to know what they looked like. Did she ever draw anything?
I think she wanted to sometime, but I'm
Mm,
not sure if she did. I'll have to check on that.
mm.
Um,
But
because
there's that whole kind of going back to mum and dad and saying this is what happened, and they're saying, oh yes dear, because for them it's just an imaginative play, and it's quite kind of scary actually. I mean, to think um, that it seems like they were pretty friendly, but there's the whole, the huge amount of folklore around the warning to never ever eat anything offered to you by the fairy folk, because if you do, you can never leave them. So I wonder how she feels about that now, being an adult, and whether she has children herself, and how she feels about that whole thing.
she does have now, adult grown-up children, and I don't know, if they've ever shared anything. The thing about, it's the thing about the children, and they interact with adults, about those things. I do have another story that someone shared with me when I lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I call it the fairy ball, but it's not like a dance. Do you remember the little round chime spheres, the metal balls? Seemed like they were around in the 1990s. So maybe it was on a chain, you could wear it around your neck. But if you shake them, you hear these little like chimes go on.
Okay, yeah.
The story is from a lady that lived near where I worked in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I worked in this really old area of Santa Fe called the Barrio de Analco, which is really ancient and where the oldest church in the United States is. This adobe church was catty corner from where I worked. And then there were people, in fact, the people next door I made friends with, they had ghostly stuff happening just, feet from where I worked. So there were two ladies a couple doors down that lived in this old adobe home, and they had a bed and breakfast by night, usually for grown-ups, whatever. And then during the day, they watched children. It's like a daycare during the day. So Joanne told me this story. I made friends with the folks there, and she knew that I was really fascinated with intriguing stories. So she said there were 7-year-old girl twins that came by day for the daycare. And one day, one of them arrived. They had received this little cute little gift, and it was the little fairy ball, that makes the
Mm.
pretty chime kind of sound when you shake it. And the girl said, look what I got. And Joanna said, well, do you know what that is and what to do with it? And the girl said, no. So she said, well, it's a fairy ball and you go out into our garden and you shake it and the fairies come around. And the girl said, okay. So, um, they all got busy with their day to kind of describe the back of that house to help you understand the story. So it's maybe I'd say about at least 50 feet from the Santa Fe River, which we would probably in Kentucky just call a creek. So it's a really small thing that had some mountain snow melt runoff. And the yard was like a grassy area. But closer to the house, there were these terrace gardens made with rock walls on the side. And the rocks were those really soft, round, like river stones, the big.
Yes.
Yeah, so just kind of paint that picture. So so the kids could play around and all that in the garden, and there were pretty flowers and everything. And so they both got busy with their day. At the end of the day, the kids were lining up to have their custodial adults come pick them up. And the girl walked up to Joanne and kind of held the fairy ball and said, "Well, I did what you told me, and no fairies showed up." So you know how it is with a grown up. They might say something, very sympathetic, like try to cushion the blow of the fantasy,
Yeah.
not happening. But the girl interrupted and she said, but a hand came out of the wall holding a very big fairy ball.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
And I think about the tarot cards where each suit begins with an arm, a hand coming out of the
Mm,
clouds holding the symbol for that suit.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
that girl, she asked for something. She wanted and she asked for something. She had an expectation. And I think they gave her even really more than that she asked for. It was a very powerful metaphor.
Mm, mm. Was it a physical ball that she walked away with, or was it something that she observed?
It's something that she observed.
Mm, mm. Yeah, it's really interesting. I love how children are so open. They're often so open to these things.
There's another story from a child grown up. This is a gentleman that was from Ohio, and he's written a number of books. His name is Ted Andrews. He wrote a book called Animal Speak that
Okay.
a lot of folks are familiar with, where you look up your connection with an animal, maybe a sighting, and you see what it means. Okay, so he said when he was a kid, so maybe this was in the 1950s, wherever he grew up, there were some woods there, and kids loved to go to the woods, and there was a creek down there, and he called it Fort Apache. Everything in the movies and TV then was cowboys and Indians, and so you can
Mm.
imagine, a child just creating their own little burrow in there and having favorite spots in the woods, and we did that when I grew up in suburban St. Louis and at my great aunt's farm. So Ted Andrews said that he would often see this girl in the woods. And I don't recall him describing how she was dressed, but she always had a squirrel at her feet. And she would be like peering around a tree, kind of smiling at him and giggling. And like he would try to talk to her and she would just giggle and run down the path. He asked her, because she seemed to be his age, how come I don't see you in school? And she just kind of would laugh and giggle. One time, he went into the woods and she was kind of sad and mopey, it seemed, and down at the creek, and her squirrel wasn't with her. So he tried to talk to her and tried to talk to her, and finally she brightened up, stood up, gave him a kiss on the cheek, and said, I'll always remember you, Ted Andrews.
Oh.
And that's the last time he saw her. But he said 2 days later, the bulldozers came.
Oh no, I just got an awful shiver down my spine. Oh, that's just, oh.
So
God, what are humans like?
it's so sad.
Makes me sick.
But years later, he just figured out that she was, a tree spirit,
Part of
not like
nature,
this.
yeah.
Yeah, not like the spirit of the oak tree, but the spirits that attend to the tree, sort of thing. Right.
Yeah, that's so beautiful and so sad. God. Yeah, so sad. It does feel like she was obviously connected with nature. There's some kind of nature spirit there.
And who knows how many children have, those interesting stories. And like you said, it's kind of discernment. If they make that friend in the woods, is it, like a pioneer ghost? Was it a human spirit? Because they do have some stories of invisible friends that the children had, like, at the woods, like they would play with them and then walk back from their home into the woods. And so there is that notion of trying to tease out, is it a nature spirit that appears kind of human, or is it a human ghost, or some kind of multidimensional human looking spirit that's not, connected to nature, but yet, is there. It's really, really fascinating. My
It
friend,
is. As you say, it's hard to work out exactly, what category we feel we, like to put them in, and sometimes we just can't, and we just don't know, but it's still really wondrous and fascinating. But I, like you, I hear these stories and I think, oh, well, maybe it was this, maybe it was that, maybe it was a multidimensional being. And I've personally been listening a lot to there's a Howard Hughes podcast called it's just called Unexplained. Howard Hughes Unexplained. It's absolutely brilliant, and I think he's got about 600 episodes. And I've only recently found it, so I've been kind of trawling through them all, picking the odd one here and there to listen to, and they are all absolutely amazing stories from people. And it sounds like you'd be interested in it too, because it's UFOs, and I haven't listened to any on fairies yet, interestingly, but multidimensional beings, Bigfoot, and a little bit about the Loch Ness monster featured recently. Often when I'm listening to that, I'm thinking, oh, what could it have been this? Could it have been that? But I find it interesting also that so we know how open children are, and I know you mentioned earlier that believing is seeing, but then sometimes adults will, with no interest in fairies, as we've heard before, will have these extraordinary experiences. And I'm sure you've heard that from people too, where they're just kind of going about their business and something happens. Have you heard a lot of stories about fairies like that from people?
right, that's a good point. Actually, I do, and I'd like to share that one. My friend Ruben, I don't know that he would have been, expecting or seeking, contact with the fairy folk. He was taking a walk in a local park. We have some nice parks in Louisville, and one of them's called Cherokee Park. I wonder, should I just read this from the book or try to?
Oh, yes, please. To do
Okay,
it.
maybe I'll just read it in his own words, because I think in just kind of paraphrasing it, it just might be too short.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, so my friend Ruben is such an amazing guy, a Cuban American from Florida, and he's passed away, but he's had a couple of interesting experiences, some really powerful UFO encounters in Florida. But anyway, this is called Man of the Woods. One experience of interest came from a walk I took in Cherokee Park in Louisville, Kentucky in the mid 1990s. I remember there was no color. It was way beyond fall, the dead of winter. As I walked through the woods, it was stick and bare branches. I went along the walking and bike path through the park. I headed up the hill to Hogan's Fountain. After I had passed the little retreat area where the basketball court and fountain are, I went further into the park. The path forms a large S curve going downhill. I had gone through the first half of the curve and I came to the wooded area, which is in front of the homes that line that area of the park. At that time, I kept almost a running walk, keeping up a pretty good pace. Being a walker, one doesn't want to stop because you'll lose the momentum, the burning of calories. So I have a tendency whenever I see someone while walking to give them a quick hand wave, but to keep on going. That would keep me from getting into conversation. As I came into the straightaway, I looked directly ahead to see a figure. He was in the thick brush, sort of rising upward. He had sort of a brown jacket that peeled off. The figure was totally unclothed. At first, I had a strange feeling as I looked at this person that he was looking directly at me and had a slight smile on his face. He had very curly hair. To say that he did or didn't have horns, I couldn't swear to it. But if he had horns, they weren't large, but rather thumb size. I ignored him, thinking that it was just a winter's flasher. I continued on my brisk walk. As I came down the S curve, I started mentally and emotionally processing exactly what it was that I did see. I began to realize that the man in the woods may not have been what I first thought he was. It dawned on me that he might not have really been a flasher, but more of a Pan type figure, someone from the forest world. His jacket was long. If he was a flasher, he would have popped it open. But in this case, the man was taking off the jacket. I wondered if he saw someone going, if, excuse me, I wonder if I saw someone going into transition from one form of reality into another. I've never experienced that ever again in any time or any place where I've lived in the country. And I've had woods of my own, went down into them frequently, and I've never had any other experience of that nature, whether flasher or pan.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, that's really great. And I don't know whether you ever got to speak to him about that, but did he notice sense within himself when he encountered that being? I just wonder whether he felt it in his body or had any kind of sense about it at the time.
Yeah, he told it to me in person, and then I can't remember if this was a transcription of an audio recording or he had written it down and emailed it to me, but he was really fascinated by it. It just kind of really, like I said, not looking for anything at all, just taking a walk in the park. And but the odd thing of it is that Hogan's Fountain was a couple paid for that to be put there, and they donated it. They commissioned a sculptor, and it was the early 1900s. And Hogan's Fountain, I think that's the name of the last name of the couple that commissioned it, but it was actually a sculptor who the sculpture is of Pan. And
Ah,
I mean, it's like
and
you
this is
can't,
in the park. That's sorry,
yeah,
that
it's like right close to where he saw the figure. There is a Greek god Pan, known as a faun in Roman mythology. There is a sculpture that everyone knows in the park of this bronze figure of Pan.
And did he refer to that when he was telling you about it, that struck him too, or
I
was it?
don't I don't recall, but he knew. I mean, he knew it in general, but I didn't know if he was putting that together in some kind of meaningful way.
Mm, mm,
But it's just right there for us,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and it's often those walks alone, and it can be in local parks. It doesn't have to take place in some kind of far off nature reserve either. It can just be very, very simple. I mean, these beings, these nature spirits, are all around us. They're within even the realms of our gardens, and just local parks. They are around, and that sense of communication can take place often as you are communing with the land in your own way, sort of looking at how bare the trees are and noticing the colours and the vibe of the place, and sort of drawing yourself into that world in some way, just subconsciously, and then something happens like that. So that's really lovely, isn't it?
Oh, I love it. And I have one other I could read if you like.
Sure. And is this from the
Oh,
book entitled Tree Spirits and Wood Wisdom, or is it a different book?
this is a different book, The More True Tales of Ghost Spirits and Angels, but it's in the fairy
Mm.
section. And this lady has had a number of experiences. She lives locally here in the Louisville area, and she has had a lot. She has had people have seen her doppelganger.
Hmm.
And yeah, she's had all kind of encounters, but this is called Brownies in the Basement.
Okay.
Okay, so her name is Beth, and I'll just read it. It's short. Um, so here she goes. I have a feeling that brownies lived in our laundry room in the basement. I always sensed a playful yet slightly disturbing influence down there. My friend Mark and Aunt Pat were both somewhat afraid to go in the basement, and I've had the lights turn out on me when I was down there alone. Of course, brownies are really benevolent, although they can be mischievous. I also think some lived in the attic closet in my bedroom. I heard they provide creative inspiration, and I know I did all my best artwork in the early morning hours in my bedroom. Another fairy spirit once paid me a surprise visit. I was alone in the house, sitting in my rocking chair in the living room, when something suddenly hit the back of my chair with enough force to knock me forward out of it. I,
Oof.
I got up as fast as I could and looked down the hall to see who knocked my chair. I was delighted to see an approximately 2 foot high brownish green man covered in leaves and wearing a little olive colored cap running down the hallway, his little arms pumping as hard as they could. By the time he reached the end of the hallway, he disappeared.
Ah, that's lovely. That's great, isn't it? And I think also thinking about being in the rocking chair and rocking back and forth, that also that's the kind of action that may drop you into an altered state as well, being rocked.
Oh, totally. That's a great point. And it's
Yeah,
just almost like an archetypal image
yeah,
of,
absolutely.
yeah, what we humans do to just kind of chill out and go into a zone.
Yeah, yeah. But that's so funny. There, she's right that brownies, I'd say a laundry room is maybe a typical place that a brownie might hang out, because they they can help with housework, and as she says, they can very quickly turn, and there've been some great stories told about these experiences over the years, and I'll put a link to one or two in the show notes, because I do find those particularly interesting and quite scary, because when they turn, it turns to very much sort of poltergeist energy. So
Right, right. I
yeah,
guess if they want to, for whatever their rationale is, they want to, cause a little, stir things up.
yeah. I think it's, well, the two occasions I'm thinking of. One of them was in the 1990s, and that was in the UK. And it was a family who bought a house, and the owners of the current owners of the house said to them, "Oh, there are some brownies in this house, and they'll help you with housework." So this couple coming in thought, right, okay, they weren't really into fairies or anything like that, just thought it was just a silly thing that had been mentioned. But when they moved in, they did find that they were helped by, while the wife was at work, washing would be taken out of the washing machine and hung up, and things like, bits and pieces being put away and prepped in the kitchen, and all this sort of thing. And so she was quite amazed by it, apparently, and which she would be, of course. But then after a while, I think something happened, something triggered some sort of dissatisfaction with the wife. Kind of got fed up with these helpful brownies, and she showed her displeasure. And at that point, it switched to the brownies creating chaos essentially in the house. And she had, I remember that jam was smeared into the carpet, and things like washing powder poured somewhere where it shouldn't be, whether it was on food or something like that. I can't quite remember now. But they had a lot of hassle effectively from the brownies. So it all went really badly wrong, and they had to move house. So that was one. So that to me sounds like miscommunication, let's say. That maybe that situation could have been handled better if perhaps she had respected them. It sounds like she dishonored them in some way. The other example I'm thinking of is too old, and I can't remember. My memory is really, really bad. I can't remember the names, but it was these two old ladies that lived in a fairly big old house. I don't know if it was a manor house or something like that. And they were getting on, and they had this fairy. They called it a silky of, is it Harrington Hall or something Hall? Anyway, so this silky would help them around the house, help them out with housework, and generally be benevolent, helpful fairy. And the person that was telling this story said that they moved away from the area and then they came back some years later and the old ladies had passed on. And there was now a man that was living there, but he was having a complete nightmare because he was just getting, again, just a lot of disruption and hassle happening in the house. Lots of poltergeist type activity again. And I'm not sure that he stuck around either. So I think while relationships are running well, that's fine. But if something tips into, as I say, miscommunication or a falling out in some way, then you're going to get the rough edge of things. So yeah, she's right to be mindful about those brownies. But that's really great. Was that the only time she ever saw one of them then?
Let's see. She has a story about a fairy hound.
Oh.
Yeah, being a warning. And actually, oh, someone else has the story in that category too. Um, so the first I'm talking about is Beth, and the second one I just remember now is another storyteller author here in Louisville area, and she's a bit older. Her first name is Roberta, and her story is pretty amazing. I could kind of try to paraphrase it. It might be in one of her books, but it is truly amazing because it is some kind of spirit dog. Um, but once again, do you put that in the nature spirit category or some kind of dog appearing spirit? But Beth had one that was a warning, and I think it's in this book. I could read it to you. I was going to mention one other thing as we're talking about the house spirits. One thing I've noticed from psychics that go on calls to deal with what's really happening in this person's house. A lot of us, I think, in general society thinks, well, it's either ghostly or not, or it's versions of ghosts, when sometimes it turns out that it's an unhappy nature spirit that's in the attic or the basement, and it's not a haunting kind of ghost spirit at all. It's something that's non-human. So that's a whole nother topic. And I just want to mention really quick, I got some of these ladies' books. They're really amazing. She's German, and she talks a lot about house spirits, because they moved into, I think it was a family connection, like an old mill in Germany. And so she's, I guess, intuitive or whatever, and she was understanding and communicating with the spirits that maintain the physicality of that mill and the house. And her name, let's see, the book is Nature Spirits and What They Say, 2004. I can maybe take
Oh, I've heard of this.
Okay, maybe I could take a picture of it. I've got it referenced in the back of my book. It was originally a German, and then it was published by Floris Books in Edinburgh. Um, and her name is Verena Stahl von Holstein, or however you pronounce that. She talks about what you're referring to is that communication issues. We're cohabitating with other humans, like you mentioned, in your house, in a tight space, and um, how's it all going to work? And then, the teenager plays the music really loud, and what are you going to do about that? But sometimes it's the ghost that we have to have a talk to, like, I need my keys. You need to make my keys appear again, because I've got to go drive somewhere. Or,
Yeah.
leave my child alone because you're scaring him or her. I mean, whatever it
Yes.
is. But
Direct communication is the key.
exactly. So
Respectful direct communication. Yeah.
yeah, so that's a whole topic anyway. Okay, so let's see. Beth, so she was walking with her sister, and they encountered the fairy hound, this dog that really was not physical, but at first you can't tell. But anyway, so here it is. Legends are told in Ireland and Scotland of the large black fairy hounds. These dogs are enormous and shaggy, about the size of a cow or calf, and are generally feared as harbingers of death. This is a story of one that most likely saved the lives of 4 people right here in Jeffersontown. So we call it J-Town. That's where I live. It's kind of, Louisville grew up around J-Town. My sister and I were left alone while the rest of our family was out of town with relatives. During the day, we decided to walk her twin daughters around the block in the two-seater stroller she had for them. This big blue stroller had seats one behind the other and was terrible to try and push with the weight of the two toddlers in it. We managed pretty well, however, most of the way around the block, although at times we came close to cussing as the wheel simply refused to turn or roll correctly. When we got on Watterson Trail in front of the car wash, an old black car full of rowdy young men pulled up on Shelby Street. They began to harass my sister and me. We were getting rather frightened when luckily a lady pulled up behind them honking her horn to get them to move so she could continue driving her car. They pulled around the corner and drove on down Watterson Trail. My sister and I kept walking, glad that the woman had pulled up, but because for some reason the carload of boys was far more frightening than the usual bunch of teenagers out for a joyride. We rounded the corner on Bluebird Lane and continued talking to each other as we strolled with the girls. When we got about 3/4 of the way down the road, I noticed an enormous black shaggy dog running wildly back and forth across the back of an open field to our left. I was born with a desperate fear of dogs, and that thankfully our family pet had helped me overcome about 14 years earlier. I did not want to sound like I was still afraid of dogs, but the one I was currently watching was the size of a small horse, and it was running like mad. Finally, regardless of what she might think of me, I told my sister, I'm not afraid of dogs anymore, but that one has me a little nervous. My sister agreed, noting that if it came at us, the stroller would definitely be too hard to push quickly enough, and we might not be able to shield the girls' bodies with our own if it took after us. Just as we turned the stroller around, we were shocked to see the boys in the big black car lying in wait for us, just a little further down the road to the right. We were able to turn and go to the other direction without them ever seeing us, thanks to the enormous fairy dog that, quote, frightened us first. My sister and I remain convinced that had we not seen the dog, and had it not been so huge and acting so crazy, we would have never have turned around, and we would have been at the mercy of the young men who decided to stalk us that day. We firmly believe that the fairy dog saved our lives.
No, that's a great story, and thank you for sharing that. There's lots of stories about black dogs as well. The folklorist Mark Norman has written extensively about black dogs, and I'm hearing about them a lot. And in fact, I hope to share a story on the podcast from somebody that I've been speaking to who had a really amazing encounter with one. And in fact, I did, and it is episode 14, and it's called Guardian of the Mountain, if you want to check that one out. But I'm also listening to podcasts that talk a lot about black dogs as well, and the Howard Hughes one. There's a really great episode called, I think it's Beasts of Britain, and I can't remember the author, unfortunately, but I'll try and link that on the show notes and to you. But it is really fascinating. These beasts are seen regularly, and like you say, sometimes they do appear in a protective manner. They do appear with some kind of protective job to do. So that is really fascinating. And they do seem to, other times, they seem to be some kind of manifestation of nature as well, in the same way that fairies are. So there's a lot there.
Right. Roberta's story, she might be fascinating to interview. Because it's just so amazing. She could tell it herself, but basically she grew up on a rural farm, a rural community in the Depression in Kentucky, and she's had all kinds of experiences. She had an African-American man appear to save her when a tornado came in, and he got her to lie down in a ditch and be protected, and then the tornado passed and he was gone. He was just there to help her. And she mentioned that when she got home to her parents safely, and they said, well, don't you know that he just died? So Roberta has all kinds of stories, and she is a professional storyteller. She's amazing with a lot of ghost story collection books. But when the old days, there wasn't, you couldn't turn on the TV to get get the Doppler radar to see when a storm was coming in. So literally the teacher would just sometimes just look out the window and send the kids home. Like, you've got to go right
Mm.
now. And they all walk to school. And so that's how I remember it. But anyway, she probably has the best version of the story. But basically, I think it was her and her cousin were walking together back from the school. They'd been um, turned away, and I guess there was storming and raining all around because the creek was up. And they had one of those logs going across the creek. They had to get across that was like in lengthwise. It was cut in
Yeah.
half. Yeah, like with an adze, and so you would walk over it. But the water was up, touching, like almost to the top of the cut log bridge. And they suddenly noticed as they were about to cross this dog that was blocking their path. Um, it possibly might have been black. I could check her story, but a cousin wanted to run across, and the dog kind of blocked and kind of barked at them when they tried to go across. And Roberta said, "Well, my grandmother, I think it was Irish background. She always told me about the spirit dogs or whatever, the ghost dogs, or that they're a warning." And so Roberta refused to cross. And as they were talking about it, just then this wave of water came down and swept away the footbridge.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
And
Gosh.
yeah, of course, the dog was no longer there.
Mm. Mm.
But that,
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you. It's a great story. Wow. Yeah, it does seem to be happening quite a lot. It's very interesting, isn't it?
right, and you wonder, the dogs are usually generally a pretty approachable critter, in terms of, our
Mm.
connection with them over the millennia. So, if a spirit wanted to appear in a relatively safe form, rather than like some human form, you wonder if they're just choosing an option, like an angel. Like an angel
Yeah.
can appear not in glory, but just as, like, a fellow human in regular clothes. I had an angel encounter, and he just appeared in regular clothes.
Well, I mean, even if you think of, ancient Egypt, you had Anubis, who was who symbolized protection. So Anubis was the dog that kind of is laying down with his paws up front and his ears, pert above, and he denoted protection. So it seems like dogs, maybe it's about protection, maybe of place or people. So if it's of a place, then maybe they're scaring people away. Maybe if it's people, then they're warning them. I don't know. I'm just throwing ideas out there, but they do seem to have some kind of connection with protection going back some time. So, oh, that's great stuff. I mean, this is the thing about this subject. It is so wide, and it's like the more you look into it, the wider it becomes, and there are so many different experiences out there. It just seems like every family has at least one story to tell.
Mm.
If it's not in their generation, then it's generation or two back that they're able to share with the family. And I just love that. I really love that. And then, as you say, there's a certain stories about particular places. So it sounds like it's quite rich in folklore where you're from, and it sounds as if there are lots of storytellers around sharing these tales, which is brilliant.
Oh, thanks. Right. I do believe that's so. Both what's presented as true stories, and then the folklore. And of course, there's the Native Americans,
Mm.
the First Nations, and they have their, tradition. But it does get interesting. Like you said, the more you dive into it, like, because some of the UFO stories, they almost sound like, the children are playing with the little people, like the fairies. But
Yeah.
but then there's this connection with this spaceship too.
Mm.
So it does get to be just a wonderful puzzle of discernment.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Well, thank you very much, Thomas. It's been really, really interesting to chat to you. It's nice to speak to another researcher that is looking into all of this and is just as excited as I am about all these possibilities. And, you know, we could just go on forever, actually, because it's so bloody interesting. It's like we say, you kind of scratch around looking at this particular thing that you're interested in, but then, oh, but this is really interesting too. And you end up, you know, you lose yourself in this world, which I personally love. And just like you, I know you mentioned right back at the beginning that you used to have that scholastic book. What was it called again?
Strangely enough.
Strangely enough. Okay, so I always think about my book that I had, which was called Fascinating Facts, and it was a big yellow book with sort of recycled pages inside. So it was a kind of soft cover, and I think it had just been bought from a supermarket or something. But it was absolutely brilliant, and it had all sorts of things in it. It had your Bigfoot, it had, you know, the Green Children of Woolpit, it had ghosts, and I remember one story about these green patches of earth where people would just disappear and they were never seen again. And just, you know, the Mary Celeste, all sorts of mysterious goings on in the world. And I absolutely loved that book. I don't know what happened to it. I think my mum chucked it in a jumble sale or something, which is tended to be what she did with some of my things. But it really does stirs you as a child, because I feel like we do know that this world is a lot more mysterious than we're told. We know it innately, and we are, you know, maybe given space to explore that as a child, then not so much as an adult. If you're asking questions, people might label you in a certain way if you're into certain things. But as you say, the interest in ghosts has definitely expanded, and people are really, you know, there's loads of TV programs about ghost hunting and all of that kind of thing now. And even the that new series that is it called Unexplained on Netflix? Oh, Unsolved Mysteries. They also made Stranger Things. So there was
Stranger
some.
Things. Yeah. Okay, right.
Yeah.
I'm pretty media impaired, but I
Okay.
hung out with a lady who we would watch that together, and it was pretty fascinating. And you know, it's like sooner or later you get into, you know, portals or, you know, that kind of gateway kind of things. It almost seems inevitable. Even Star Trek back in the 60s, you know, it's when in doubt, you know, we've got a portal here or whatever they called it. Well, but yeah, I just want to say, I told ghost stories the February before last. It was right before the shutdown, the pandemic shutdown, at a grade school. And this fifth grade boy, he had evidently watched very closely to know exactly when he could find me out in the hallway without anyone else being there. You know, because I was working with tons of kids, and it was 2 full weeks, you know, Monday through Friday. And I had brought my ghost story books. I told some ghost stories, but we were also doing all kinds of artwork. And but he made sure that it was just me and him out in the hallway. And basically he said, you know, I see dead people. So obviously I tried to be very supportive in listening to him and, you know, giving him some, you know, encouragement. But kids are
Yeah.
just desperate to find someone to talk to about that, particularly I think the cohort of children that, you know, we might be in, where we have some gifts and we are, you know, kind of almost our soul is already, you know, going to be oriented toward that trajectory.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. But I just love exploring this area of fairies, and that's definitely where my heart lies. But as I do that, I'm looking into all sorts of unexplained and extraordinary experiences and encounters, and it just really the jigsaw starts to sort of form a picture of this sense that, you know, there is this mysterious universe and there's just so much that we don't know. So it's really great to speak to someone like yourself who can testify to that the more they speak to people, the more they learn. And sometimes it's right there in your family, and sometimes, like you say, you chatted to your friend about something and she happened to have that experience. She hadn't spoken to you about it before, but it was there, it was waiting to be told. And just by talking about these things, it does kind of bring them out, and then we kind of learn a little bit more, because then we're like, oh yeah, that's really like this, and kind of reminds me of that. It's just so interesting. I do love it, and it makes me think of the old days where people might have been sitting around the fire, all telling their own tales. That's what it was all about, is it?
Right. Or like the ladies at the quilting bee, they're all around the
Well,
quilt.
yeah,
Their hands are busy sewing. And if you bring up that, someone saw our dead mama, then everyone's going to start,
yeah,
sharing stories in the same category. And I'm really
that's
happy
right.
to chat anytime, and really appreciate you,
Oh,
having some time.
thank you so much. It's really great to chat now. It's so much to talk about, so let's definitely talk again. But
Right. We'll have to
yeah,
save some good topics for another
yes,
chat.
let's
Yeah,
have another chat another
definitely.
time.
Time to renovate, transmutate. Time to renovate.
Market delivers the same warning. We must not look at goblin men, we must not buy their fruits. Who knows upon what soil they fed their hungry, thirsty roots? We discussed goblins with poltergeist tendencies, and the two accounts I spoke of were the Silkie of Denton, not Harrington Hall, and a poltergeist brownie event in the 1980s, which was originally collected by Colin Parsons in his book Encounters with the Unknown. Both these incidents are described in my show notes about fairies in houses in episode 10 of this podcast. It's entitled Stay or Go. You can find the link to previous podcasts and all show notes at scarletofthefae.com. The girl who describes rattling her fairy ball and watching a hand appear from the wall sounds like an invocation. Curious laughter, tinkling bells, and strange music are sometimes described by those who encounter fairies. Often they're not able to fully explain the sounds, just that they're otherworldly. I wonder, did the strange bell sound resonate with a parallel existence, or was it simply the little girl's firm intention that the fairy ball would have the effect that created the potential for it to happen? The general interplay between us, our consciousness, and these beings and their places of existence gives us much to ponder on. Then there's the sad story of the little boy and his friend in the woods who disappeared when the forest was bulldozed. Shared encounters like this provide an important reminder to protect our wild spaces and local environments. I think of the strong fairy faith that is still present to this day in places like Ireland and Iceland, and how these beliefs serve to protect certain landscapes from development. If these beings are interconnected with natural environments, which seems to be the case given the great number of supernatural encounters which attest to this, not to mention the vast numbers of indigenous communities in which this belief is held, then we're causing untold damage to their places of existence. From this perspective, humankind is truly ignorant in the way it currently treats its home planet. It seems, sadly, they know not what they do. Well, we've reached the end of another episode, and I'm learning so much along with you, dear listener. If you've enjoyed this share, then please consider sharing it with one other person whom you think might enjoy it. And don't forget to check the links for Thomas Freese on scarletofthefae.com. As I mentioned, there's a bonus episode to follow this one, which is available for patrons at patreon.com/the Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast. Although our explorations here sometimes force us to look at difficult truths about ourselves as the human race, also bear in mind that many more humans are kind, loving, and enlightened, and there are plenty of examples of that if we look around us. We're capable of bringing about great change, as so many have done before us in the face of difficult and challenging times, and we will do so again. So keep the faith, keep connected with each other, and always remain curious.